Tucked away in the corner of the Oxenden Cemetery stands the gravestone of William Henry Preston. He passed away in the autumn of 1882, living to the age of 71. Pretty good for the 1800s. When he passed, he left behind a family, including his wife, Mary Ann. She was younger and lived another 27 years. Mary Ann had wanted to be buried beside her late husband, but when she died and her family came to visit the Preston grave, they found that their father's gravestone had been vandalized, repurposed into a memorial for a nameless murdered man. In this episode, we'll be exploring the story behind the stranger's grave and the Keppel tragedy.
John Bailey, a farmer, was working the land and living in a small house on a section of Lot 4, Concession 20. Mr. Bailey seemed to be in a new stage of his life. He was in his mid-40s and living separately from his wife and children, apparently also looking for new love. And without his wife and family around, John needed help around the farm. He hired the neighbor's daughter, named Ellen McClary, to do the cooking and general housework, and a man, believed to be a hobo and name unknown, to help with the manual labor. During the day of Thursday, March 25th, 1886, John Bailey was in the nearby town of Wyerton. He was seen leaving around 7 p.m. His home was about 3 or 4 kilometers away. Shortly after 8 o'clock, neighbors noticed flames and smoke coming from the residence and rushed over to help. When they got to the house, they found the doors stuck, possibly locked, and needed to break a window to get inside. Once in, they discovered the bodies of 2 men, that of John Bailey and the other of the nameless farmhand. The house was too far gone at this point, so the men quickly worked to move the bodies out of the burning building.
Dr. Fisher from Wyerton was sent to examine the bodies. He found that the men had not died from the smoke, but had been brutally murdered. Here's a section of a newspaper report going into the details of the gruesome crime. Fair warning here, the papers didn't hold back in those days. You can see there that this was a pretty ruthless murder, and the events that follow with the trial and investigation would make for a great murder mystery novel. So obviously the authorities show up, the bodies are taken in to be fully examined, and an inquest is called to figure out what has happened. Some of the neighbors that were at the fire that night gave testimonials. Notably, Charles McClary, Ellen's brother, and Ellen herself. Charles talks about being over at the house earlier that day asking for help with grinding his axe. It was just the nameless stranger there at the time, and he was drying his wet socks on the stove, so he couldn't help. I mention this because Charles says he took his axe with him, but when leaving, he noticed another sitting outside the house. Charles came back later that night and helped get into the burning house by breaking a window.
With Ellen's testimony, some possible suspects and motives started to emerge. She talks about John Bailey and a man named James King getting into a spat a couple of weeks prior to the fire. It was apparently over her. Both men were vying for the attention of the young Ellen. Some sharp words were exchanged, but it didn't come to blows. Also, I know it was a different time and all, but Ellen McClary was 18 and John Bailey was 43, over double her age. A little icky.
Yeah.
At the end of the inquest or trial, not sure what to call it, the jury returned with the verdict that the said John Bailey and an unknown came by their death on the 25th day of March 1886 on Lot 4, Township of Keppel, 20th Concession, by being willfully and maliciously murdered by some person or persons at present unknown to the jury.
The townspeople are shaken by this murder. They want answers and they want justice. An $800 reward is posted for information that leads to a conviction. That'd be somewhere around 25 grand in today's money. The local authorities believe the McClarys know more than they're saying, but they don't know how to prove it. They ask the Attorney General's office for help. They get a letter back from the Deputy Attorney General. He tells them that they've got some undercover detectives working on it and to not tell anyone.
Detective Rogers, who seems to have been the lead on the case, had a plan. He has a detective go undercover disguised as a tea peddler. I guess that's a common job in 1886. The tea peddler detective befriends Ellen and convinces her into taking a trip with him. They board a train in Wyerton and travel to the nearby town of Palmerston. There, they check into a hotel as man and wife. Unbeknownst to Ellen, Detective Rogers is hiding under the bed in the room they're given. The undercover detective gets Ellen talking, and she eventually confides in him that she did have more knowledge of the murders. She tells him that the Saturday before the murder, James King and a man named John Wilson came by the Bailey house looking to finish him. The only one there at that time was Ellen, and she told the two men to come back on Thursday when she believed John Bailey would be home alone. Ellen goes on to tell the undercover detective that she saw the men again on that Thursday, I assume when she was at Bailey's making dinner. They tell her to go home while they go off to hide in the bush. Ellen must be watching the property a bit because she says she sees King and Wilson a while later heading towards the house, and shortly after that, the fire is seen. After hearing all of this, Detective Rogers pops out from under the bed, promptly arrests Ellen, and subsequently has James King and John Wilson found and arrested as well.
In the preliminary trial that follows, all the evidence is presented: the previous testimonials, the overheard confession, and Dr. Fisher's post-mortem findings. At the end of this, the magistrate concludes that James King and John Wilson will have a trial for murder, and they're both sent to jail to await that trial. Neither get bail. Ellen was held as a witness. Since she wasn't able to pay the bail, she was also sent back to jail. They would have been there for quite a while, probably about 6 months before the trial began. When it did, it basically became he said, she said, with King and Wilson pointing their fingers at Ellen and Ellen pointing her finger at them. Ellen stuck to her new story of James King and John Wilson being the murderers, and the two men outright denied any involvement, saying it was probably Ellen who committed the crime. Unfortunately for the deceased's family and friends, no one was budging, and with no other evidence, James, John, and Ellen all went free.
Which brings us back to the stranger's grave. Some time between that trial and the Prestons wanting to bury their mother, an unknown person decided to commemorate that poor, nameless farmhand. But why here? And what do we know about this stranger? Well, we don't know much. The neighbors never knew his name, and the court never knew his name. At the time, it's possible it wouldn't have been a big priority for them, considering his background. There is one account of the stranger in the local newspaper, the Wyerton Echo. It just mentions his arrival in town, gives a brief description talking about his tattered clothes and his tall height, but that's really it. Without a name, his identity has been lost to time. So why did someone choose the Preston grave to deface? After the murder, the stranger was apparently buried at the back of Oxenden Cemetery, probably somewhere behind this grave. When the stranger was buried, the coffin used was supposedly too small and the body was kind of folded up to fit. Whether his treatment didn't sit well with someone or that someone just wanted to draw attention to a case that was never resolved, we'll never know. What we do know is that two men lost their lives on March 25th, 1886, and their killers got away with it. I'm sure after listening to this, you'll have your suspicions, but anyone who truly knew has long since taken it to their grave.
We've got a few additional thoughts and facts that didn't really fit into the telling of the story. You may have noticed a couple of peculiar things about the gravestone. The first is the spelling of murdered. Was whoever carved this message just a lousy speller? Well, they could have been using an older spelling of the word. Actually, in some of Shakespeare's plays, this was the spelling used. But by the end of the 1800s, when this was most likely carved, the preferred way would have been the modern spelling with the extra E in there. So perhaps people are right in judging the Vandals' literacy. The other detail you may have noticed is that the stone says Concession 19 while we've been saying Concession 20. Every newspaper article I read, including those quoting the official verdict of the inquest, all say Concession 20. It is very odd that someone who would go to the trouble of making this statement would get it wrong, but unless they had some knowledge that was never shared, they simply messed up. And finally, in the 1980s, Eleanor Preston, a descendant of the Prestons whose grave this is, was, wrote a small piece in the local Keppel history book. In it, she says that the Preston family actually knew the identity of the person who defaced the grave, but chose not to have them punished or announce who it was. In our research, out of all the main people involved in this story, Bailey, the two McClarys, King, Wilson, the only gravestone we were able to find is that of the stranger. It's a bit ironic, but the man with no name is the reason the others in this story are still remembered to this day.